as you mentioned, Gavin, a little bit of a interesting story emerged on Twitter a little bit after we went live today in our off hours, right when we were eating dinner. I was like, holy shit. Mehdi Hassan had tweeted out, or quote tweeted rather, a video clip from the most recent appearance, as you mentioned, of Krystal and Sagar on the Joe Rogan Experience. And let's just say Joe Rogan puts his foot in his mouth, right? And completely, just kind of misses the mark with this one. I think it's a bummer that Krystal's getting looped into this, because I think the points that she was trying to make the entire time she was on that show were pretty salient. But if I were her, I would be beating my head against the table because of Joe's framing here, because it basically just indulges every single bad faith criticism of Ilhan Omar. But yeah.
Yeah, so as Zach mentioned, bit of a controversy afoot online surrounding Joe Rogan and Krystal Ball. You guys might be aware that Krystal and Sagar were just on the Joe Rogan Experience for the second time. And the topic of Ilhan Omar came up, who, of course, just was removed from her committee assignments on the Foreign Affairs Committee. And they got into the controversy that inspired her removal in the first place. Of course, the all about the Benjamins comments in reference to AIPAC. And let's take a look here at these comments that were made on the Joe Rogan Experience. Then we'll break it down, and I can give you guys my opinion too.
Do you see him sitting next to Ilhan Omar, where she's apologizing for talking about it's all about the Benjamins? Yeah, which is just about money. She's talking about money. She shouldn't have apologized. That's not an anti-Semitic statement. I don't think that is. It's about Benjamins or money. You know, the idea that Jewish people are not into money is ridiculous. Listen, that's like saying Italians aren't into pizza. It's fucking stupid. Listen, it's fucking stupid.
I understand that the way she phrased it, like she could have phrased it a different way so that people would have less of a freak out. But can you not talk about the influence of money in DC?
Of course.
This is very obvious. There's a very obvious reason why for my entire life, there's been a uniparty consensus around our policy vis-a-vis the Israeli government and a total inability or unwillingness to criticize the Israeli government. It has everything to do with organization and, yes, money, just like every other fucking interest in DC. And so, yeah, the fact that she said that and she got kicked off the Foreign Affairs Committee, look, I have issues and disagreements with Ilhan Omar, but she actually is one of the more courageous voices on foreign policy who's willing to call out some of the hypocrisy and bullshit in U.S. foreign policy. Extremely rare in terms of United States congressmen. So it's actually kind of a real loss that she got kicked off that committee.
Yeah, so let's take it back from the top. I'm not going to play the whole clip again, but I want to tell you specifically my problem with what Joe Rogan said here. I don't think that Krystal Ball said anything wrong. I don't think that she should be taking any heat for this. And I don't even really care about the fact that she didn't stop him in his tracks and, call him out right there live on air. It's whatever. It's not her responsibility to tone police Joe Rogan for what was, admittedly an inartful phrasing. But yeah, let's take this from the top one more time. I want to tell you guys what my issue is with what Joe said.
Do you see him sitting next to Ilhan Omar, where she's apologizing for talking about it's all about the Benjamins? Yeah, which is just about money. She's talking about money. She shouldn't have apologized. That's not an anti-Semitic statement. I don't think that is. It's about Benjamins or money. The idea that Jewish people are not into money is ridiculous.
So the problem is that Ilhan Omar wasn't talking about Jewish people. She was talking about AIPAC. She was talking about the Israeli government. Just your average Jewish person has little, if nothing, to do with AIPAC or the Israeli government. Criticizing AIPAC, criticizing the Israeli government and their corrupting influence in the halls of Congress is not reflective of Jewish people. So Joe Rogan just saying, of course Jewish people love money. Well, it's that's not really the point Ilhan Omar was making. She was talking about the Israeli government. She was talking about the corrupting influence of AIPAC money, which of course is a legitimate thing to talk about. And of course it's not anti-Semitic to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that that's the problem. And what Joe's kind of just like fumbling and look, like clearly the fact that like, oh, like Italians love pizza, like it's just like, okay, well, let's just throw in another stereotype to be like, of course Italians like pizza. So like I thought that was like a little bit caveman-y and dumb, but I totally agree that Krystal tries to steer the conversation back in the appropriate direction. She's like, well, like I'm not talking about Jewish people, neither was Ilhan Omar, and immediately pivots back to talking about a substantive critique and goes on to compare not the government of Israel to the Jewish people, but to our own corrupt, nefarious government, which is awash in capitalism and all of that. But I just thought it was massively clumsy and cringy of Joe Rogan here. And it does show that, I don't know. I just think it shows that maybe where he's been hanging out, where his head's going, the fact that you talk about the as soon as Jewish people come up, it's like, oh yeah, like, oh, do you want to pretend like they don't have money? Just in the context of the broader Republican Party right now, which has been a lot more like vocally leaning towards anti-Semitism, especially when you look at guys like Steven Crowder. They love to dog whistle about like how Jewish people are running the media and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that they will probably leap on this. But again, like, was Joe trying to be anti-Semitic here? No. But I think he did lean on an anti-Semitic trope, which kind of washes out the very valid and legitimate argument that Krystal is trying to make to the mainstream populace that does want to portray Ilhan Omar as some sort of an anti-Semite, right? Like they can point to this clip and be like, see, even Joe Rogan, when he's trying to defend Ilhan Omar, pretends that the entire AIPAC or Israel lobby is like representative of like the Jewish people or whatever. You know what I mean? So I think it just gets in the way of the substance of what Krystal was trying to argue.
And the substance of what Ilhan Omar herself was saying in the first place. She wasn't talking about the Jews. She was talking about AIPAC and the corrupting influence that it exerts over politicians, over candidates in Washington, D.C., in this country, which, again, is completely fair to talk about. And it's incredibly courageous of Ilhan Omar to talk about it in the first place. She's one of the few outspoken critics of Israel and of AIPAC, one of the few Congress members brave enough to voice said criticisms in the first place. So, she didn't do anything wrong. I think Krystal's 100% correct that she should never have apologized for making those statements. And yeah, well, Joe Rogan definitely kind of slipped up and was not artful in this specific incident. It's like, that's not terribly shocking given who Joe Rogan is. Like when I was watching this podcast with Joe Rogan, Krystal, and Sagar, there was like 10 times where I was like, oh, like, that's just who he is, not to excuse it, but I'm just saying I'm not terribly shocked that he said something that was like, slightly off color.
That's actually a great point because it's like what he did was like indulge like passively in like an anti-Semitic trope, but it's also like, yeah, it's fucking Joe Rogan. So I think that's a great point, Gavin, and one where it's like, okay, how surprised can you really be? This dude is not exactly like the sharpest tool in the shed when it comes to like his political analysis. You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. And Krystal did respond on Twitter to some of the criticism. Representative Josh Gottheimer weighs in here and said, it's despicable language like this that leads to attacks and threats against Jewish people. Joe Rogan has a massive platform, and it's infuriating to watch him and Krystal Ball promote blatant, dangerous anti-Semitic tropes, including those masquerading as anti-Israel sentiments. So again, it's one thing to criticize Joe Rogan. I think it's fair to criticize him for the way he framed that. However, I don't think it's fair to rope Krystal into it. She's literally just defending Ilhan Omar for making factual statements about the corrupting influence of money in politics, specifically as it relates to AIPAC, which is one of the most corrupting influences as far as money in politics in America goes. Krystal responds to that and says, is it anti-Semitic to point out that you're corrupt? And links to this article, or rather posts a screenshot of this David Sirota, Andrew Perez piece, talking about how Josh Gottheimer himself is the billionaire's Democratic bag man. Democratic Representative Josh Gottheimer is the House's top recipient of private equity cash, and lo and behold, he's helping Wall Street undermine the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill. So she's basically saying, hey, I'm just pointing out corruption. It's no more anti-Semitic to point out your corruption than it is to point out the corrupting influence that AIPAC is in Congress, which I think is, fair to say.
Oh yeah, this is actually a great clapback from Krystal Ball because it underlines the point that she was trying to make, the substantive critique that she was lobbying against AIPAC. It had nothing to do with the Jewish community. It was Joe Rogan that intentionally or unintentionally conflated those two things in a way that I think we would all agree is oafish and problematic, but, you know, as Gavin said, maybe not surprising. And then Josh Gottheimer tries to seize on a political like slam dunk, and she basically swats it away, you know, and is like, no, I'm full stop against corruption across the board. Fun fact also about Josh Gottheimer I saw on Twitter is a lot of people resurfaced an article in the internet or in the Intercept where they illustrate just what a horrible boss he is and how he treats his staffers like shit. So more context on that guy that's coming out here just appalled at the behavior of others. It's like, well, maybe you should look inward and take stock of your own treatment of people around you before you go barking up that tree with everyone else. But I agree. Yeah, damn, Krystal kind of got him there 100%. Like, I think that it's clear that Krystal was in there trying to defend Ilhan Omar for reasons that were totally just and valid. She was trying to explain to Joe why it was unnecessary for her to fold into that. Joe kind of clumsily misunderstands, and she immediately writes the course again to get back to the substance of the argument, which is no, it's not anybody but the government. And I thought she did a really good job clarifying that by, you know, immediately making it a parallel to the United States government. You know, the rest of us, right? And you know, what a great point. We you know, to point out nobody loves money more than America, right? So, you know, you just draw a parallel to our country and our politicians who are awash in all kinds of fucking finances and conflict of interests. And you know, you could see that it's not a problem that's unique to any group of individuals based on race or religion. This is something that happens in capitalist systems across the board.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And here's a screenshot posted by Halal Flow of, you know, the article that you just mentioned, Zach, about Josh Gottheimer being a terrible boss, according to some former staffers. Apparently, according to this Furious, Gottheimer spotted the car of the staffer who had driven him to the event and channeled all of his rage on it, raining blow after blow down upon its roof. So, yeah, there's a little insight into his behavior. Not that that's particularly relevant to the conversation about anti-Semitism, but still pretty funny.
Yeah, you know, just one of those things where it's like, hey, if you're going to constantly check on everyone else's behavior, like maybe you shouldn't treat everybody around you like shit, or people are going to bring up those receipts, you know?
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, definitely pretty interesting stuff. Krystal and Joe Rogan are both taking a lot of heat on kind of, you know, normie political Twitter, like you mentioned, Zach. Some people, you know, saying, I actually want to stop banging the Jews don't count drum at some point, but hard to do when a racist myth about Jews is just said breezily on one of the biggest podcasts in the world and no one gives a fuck.
I think people did give a fuck. Like, I mean, nobody's saying that it was perfect, right? I think that to group Krystal Ball in it along with it is pretty bad faith.
Yeah.
Like, what is she doing? Platforming the biggest podcaster in the world. It's like, do you see how clumsy that argument is? The Joe Rogan podcast is going to get a fuck ton of views, regardless of whether or not Krystal Ball is on there. And she's not responsible for what comes out of his mouth. And like I said, she immediately pivoted the conversation away from the, you know, kind of misunderstanding, if you want to be charitable, of Joe, you know, indulging in the trope, back to a very serious and valid political argument. So it's hard to see why you would be so upset with her.
Exactly.